Okay, scholars, today I'm going to be talking about governments and the economy and different types of economies, different structures that we see in different governments. Of course, here in the United States, we have a capitalist economy and we have a democratic government, meaning that each eligible voter is able to cast their vote for different candidates for office who will then be elected to office and represent us in either Austin if we're talking about state government, or in Washington, D.C. if we're talking about the federal government. So each state has its own state legislature and its own way of passing laws, just as on a national level we have our senators and our representatives who make up the House of Representatives, and they vote on various legislation, which then goes to the president to be either vetoed or signed into legislation. And so we have a representative democracy. We all have a vote on our candidates, and then the candidates make decisions as our representatives in either Austin or Washington, D.C. And of course, there are also local elections for governor, for mayors and district attorneys and sometimes judges and things of that nature as well. But we're going to focus more on the different government structures that we see around the world and different economies. And as I said, we are a capitalist society in that the means of production are owned by individuals and by stockholders who buy stocks in publicly traded companies. So let's start out with some basic definitions. An economic system refers to the social institution through which goods and services are produced, distributed, and consumed. And as I said, here we have a situation in the United States where different factories are owned by stockholders, and there may be a majority stockholder who has the most control over what the company does, but individuals are the owners of the means of production in a capitalist society. Okay, in a socialist society, the people as citizens of the country are viewed as the owners of the means of production. And then in a communist country, of course, then the government is in more control. We'll talk about the differences between socialism and communism and between capitalism and socialism as well here in a few minutes. We also want to define political systems. The political system is the social institution that is founded on a recognized set of procedures for implementing and achieving society's goals. The primary goals of a government, a political system, is to provide leadership that can protect the country from outside threats, or in some cases inside threats. In the case of domestic terrorism and things of that nature. But political structures also do a lot more than that. They determine how wealth is redistributed, if it is redistributed, by levying taxes and building infrastructure for different industries. So, the reason that we have an interstate system of transportation is that some of our tax dollars that go to Washington, D.C. are then used to build highways, hospitals, public libraries, schools, and things of that nature. All of those things are funded by our taxes, either our income taxes that we send to Washington, D.C., or our property taxes and things of that nature, sales tax that goes to the state government and then is used to help meet the needs of society. So we have a public education system because many years ago, centuries ago, we decided that an educated population was important, because to have a democracy where people vote for their representatives, they need to have an understanding of the political system. They need to have an understanding of what policies will impact them in positive and negative ways. And the only way to do that was to educate people. And by educating them, not only do you educate them to be better voters, but you also educate them for the economic system, to go out and have skills that are necessary to meet the needs of society in that way, right? If you're trying to build computers, but you don't have anybody who can operate the machinery to develop computer chips or to assemble computers once they get all the parts together, if you don't have an educated population that can do those kinds of things, then you're not going to be very successful. So the political system is there to provide protection, but also then to determine who gets what. Our government hands out subsidies to different corporations. We've been subsidizing, for example, the oil companies, the petroleum companies for many, many decades. We also subsidize farmers because we recognize that having a good source of clean, safe food to eat is very important. And so we need to have farmers be able to make a living. And unfortunately, farming is a very difficult business to survive in. And without government help, in many cases, many farmers would have fallen by the wayside and would have had to give up farming. And we're seeing the family farm really beginning to go away nowadays. There are fewer and fewer family farms every year. Okay. So in terms of economic systems, the Industrial Revolution, of course, influenced the way that our economy has developed significantly. It brought changes to the social organization of the workplace. Today we have a boss who has supervisors beneath him, who has foremen beneath him or her. Don't want to be sexist here. And then we have workers on the line in the assembly line. And so when we think about a traditional factory, it's certainly been influenced by the Industrial Revolution, and there is that hierarchical bureaucratic structure that we talked about in a previous chapter. And so industrial society is quite a bit different from an agricultural society where you're kind of your own boss, right? If you own a family farm and you go out there and you've got all those acres that have to be plowed and you have to plant your crops, and then you have to nurture those crops and weed and feed and water and protect them from disease and animals that might want to graze on your crops and all those kinds of things. And then you have to harvest the crop and get it to market. But you're really your own boss to a large degree. But when we developed, factories through the Industrial Revolution, that meant now that you're selling your labor in exchange for money. And it drastically changed the way that our society functioned, okay, in a lot of different ways. Capitalism and socialism are the two basic types of government or economic systems rather, that we're going to talk about. That distinguish contemporary societies. Many people see socialism as kind of a dirty word, and if you're accused of being a socialist nowadays in the United States, that's seen as an attack. It's seen as a negative thing. But in much of the world, being a socialist is not considered so awful, because what socialists tend to say is that there are certain industries that do not need to be run for profit. And I've mentioned before that, in my view, the healthcare system and the prison system, those are two systems that probably shouldn't be run for profit. So I think most rational people today believe that there should be some level of socialism in modern societies. And let me just give you an example. You might already be saying, oh no, Mr. Harrod, socialism's awful. But think about this. Our public education system is an example of socialism, because we all pay property taxes and sale taxes, and we pay our federal income tax, and those tax dollars then go to support a public education system that is there for the common good. And even if you don't have children going to school, you still have to pay those taxes because we decided as a society that it's very important that our population, our citizenry, be educated. And because if we don't provide public education, only wealthy people can afford education. That's for the common good. And I think healthcare and corrections for criminal activity should be looked at in the same way. When you put a price tag and you make a commodity for profit, then you allow the market to determine the cost. And we've seen what has happened with healthcare costs, and we've also seen prison populations explode because we have all these private prisons being built, and law enforcement feels a certain amount of pressure to fill those prisons, and the courts feel a certain amount of pressure to fill those prisons. And I'm just not sure that that really encourages rehabilitation of people who are accused of committing crimes. So I'm not suggesting that that all industries should become socialistic in their approach, that the government should take over all industries. I'm just saying that there are certain industries where it kind of makes some sense to not allow profit to drive the decisions that are made in those industries. And healthcare and corrections are two that I can see, as well as I said, public education. But we do see that public education is coming under attack by many people who don't even believe that we should be paying taxes to support public education, in spite of all the clear benefits that public education provides this country. So capitalism, as I said, is an economic system where the ownership of the means of production are in the hands of individuals and, of course, as I mentioned, stockholders. And we tend to practice this kind of laissez-faire approach to it, where you should keep your hands off of business as much as possible. The government, you being the government in this situation, we should not have over-regulation, that we should allow supply and demand to determine prices and things of that nature, quality control and all of those kinds of things. That approach, works in some industries, but not so well in other industries. If there's plenty of competition, then a laissez-faire approach may work better. But when there becomes a couple of big players in an industry, then we need some regulations. And I think even most capitalists would agree that there needs to be some regulation, that unfettered capitalism can be particularly harmful to society, and not just to our society, but to the global society as well, in terms of countries being exploited and things of that nature. So capitalism today features government regulation and economic relations. The government offers often monitors prices, quality for safety reasons, and environmental standards to make sure that these companies are not taking advantage of their power and polluting and selling unsafe products. Again, that regulation is there to make sure that consumers are protected, and to, in some cases, protect the industries themselves. If you've got one company that begins to dominate the market and engage in unfair practices, that can be damaging to the other companies, and so the smaller companies need some protections in place as well. So a monopoly is defined as a situation where a single company comes to dominate a particular industry, which allows them then to set their own prices and quality standards and things of that nature. And so most capitalistic countries, particularly the United States, has rules and laws against monopolies developing, and every now and then you'll hear about a couple of companies are wanting to merge, and they have to get government approval to merge, or you'll hear about somebody threatening to break up. The government is threatening to break up a particular company because it's gotten too big and too powerful. And so that's a result of our beliefs that there needs to be some regulation, and the monopolies are harmful, because if you're the only game in town, if Ford Motor Company is the only cars you can buy, they can charge whatever prices they want to charge. And so we need Chevrolet and the other, we need competition from the others, or one company becomes too dominant. So, as I said, unfettered capitalism not only can hurt consumers here in the United States, but it can hurt, now that these companies are going global, it can hurt companies and countries other than the United States. Now, socialism is an economic system in which the means of production and distribution in society are collectively rather than privately owned. And so it rejects that laissez-faire philosophy that free competition benefits the general public, and it's more focused on government being involved in decisions about what products to produce and what kinds of prices are appropriate and things of that nature. So if you've got a country like Canada that has socialized medicine, they determine how much you should pay when you go see the doctor. They determine how much your medications should cost if you are prescribed some medications. And that's what we mean by socialized medicine. There are price controls in place, and that cuts down on the number of people who get rich on a particular industry, but it also ensures more access to people who have fewer resources. There is government ownership of all major industries in a country that is more socialistic. The more industries that are owned by government and operated by government, the more socialist we would call that particular country. Communism is defined as an economic system under which all property is community owned and no social distinctions are made on the basis of people's abilities to produce. I don't think that there are too many people in this country today who are in favor of communism. We've seen that, communism has a fatal flaw. If nobody is rewarded for exceptional performance, as in a communist society, then there's no real incentive to excel and work hard and do better than the people around you. And that lack of competition is devastating over the long haul to the communist country. The former Soviet Union and a few other countries have tried to practice communism with varying degrees of success. Now, China is viewed as a communist country, but let's keep in mind that they have allowed a number of industries and private ownership of businesses, and so they're allowing capitalism to creep into their economic system, and that has allowed them to move from number 15 on the list of biggest economies to number 2. And so I don't think we can really call China a completely communist economy anymore, because they are allowing some private ownership and wealth to be generated. In a truly communistic society, that doesn't happen. Everybody is expected to have roughly the equivalent economic situation, and so there's far less stratification. But even in the most communistic countries in the world, the former Soviet Union and China, 20 years ago, there were still those who had less and those who had more. So there was still stratification, but it wasn't as wide and as pervasive as the stratification that exists in capitalist societies. People are kind of crunched more towards the middle, but members of the Communist Party or members of the Politburo in the former Soviet Union had access to resources that the common worker in a factory did not have access to. So they weren't truly communistic in the way that Karl Marx defined communism, where you were going to develop a truly classless society. I personally think that was one of the major flaws in Marx's ideas, that we could have a society where there was absolutely no stratification. I just don't think that's possible. Somebody has to be in charge of determining who gets what, and whoever that person is, or whatever that entity is, it has power over the others. So there always has to be a power structure, and power equates to stratification. So, as I said, I think Marx's idea was terribly flawed in that respect. But some of the criticisms that he made of capitalism, particularly unfettered capitalism, I think bear some discussion. Okay. So we also have this formal economy that operates, but then we also have what is called an informal economy. And the informal economy refers to the transfers of money, goods, or services that take place but are not reported to the government. So some of these things are not illegal. For example, if you sell products on eBay or Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace, but your primary living doesn't come from that. That's a part of the informal economy. You're selling, there's an exchange of goods and money there. But if you're doing it for your primary income, you're probably going to be expected to report those earnings and pay taxes on them. Okay, and so then it would become, rather than being an informal part of the economy, it moves into the realm of the formal economy. So there are estimates. It's really hard to determine just how much is going on in regards to the informal economy, but estimates say that this accounts for about 8% of the total U.S. economy. It accounts for 20 to 30% in other industrialized nations that may not be quite as good at determining, what people are earning as the United States and the IRS is here in our country. And it can account for 80 to 95% of developing nations in Africa and Asia. So those governments are not able to, keep up with and get people to report to the government what they're earning and how they're earning it to the extent that the United States is, and therefore their tax structure may suffer as well as part of that. But they don't have well-established economies in some of those countries. Okay. This can be dysfunctional for workers, this informal economy. Working conditions are often unsafe or dangerous when you're working in the informal economy. And I mentioned illegal activities. That would also be a part of the informal economy. The sale of goods and products and services that are outlawed by law would certainly fit into that informal economy as well. So if somebody's buying illegal weed, or if they're engaging in prostitution outside of Nevada, then that would be part of the informal economy as well. There's still an exchange of money for goods and services, and so that would fall into that category as well. Let's talk a little bit about power and authority. Power is this ability to exert your will over someone else to get them to do what you want, even if perhaps they don't want to do that. One cultural universal is the exercise of power and authority. And politics, as I mentioned earlier, refers to who gets what, when, and where, and how. And so politics is all about determining how our tax dollars are going to be used, how much we're going to have to pay in taxes. When we have legislation that affects taxes, that affects how much money we have to pay to the government, whether it's sales tax or property tax or federal income tax. Legislation impacts us. And so if you think about President Trump's tax reform that occurred right after he got into office, we were told that, working class and middle class families would benefit. And there was some small benefit to us, but it was not very much. But the benefit really went to, and people suggested at the time, hey, this is really going to help wealthy people and corporations. And we've seen that the post-law analysis has indicated that it very much impacted the livelihoods and the well-being of very wealthy people. But not only did it not help middle class and working class folks very much, but the tax cuts for those folks are going to end much sooner than the tax cuts for wealthy people and corporations. And in fact, some of those tax cuts for wealthy and corporations never expire unless the government changes it again, right? And now that President Biden has been elected, President-elect Joe Biden has been elected, he has vowed to undo that law because he sees it as being harmful to working and middle class people, while giving corporations and very wealthy families a great deal more of their income back. Okay, so he sees the law as being negatively impacting regular people like you and I. Okay. So as I said, power is defined as the ability to exert one's will over others. Power is exercised on national and global scales. Today we have, situations where we can tell a country, hey, you need to do this or you need to do that, or we're going to levy tariffs on you. For example, our tariff situation with China, the trade war. We told China, hey, you're going to have to quit stealing our intellectual property and without compensating us, or we're going to raise tariffs on a number of your products that come to the United States. And so we've gotten into this trade war with each side levying tariffs on the other side's exports. Okay. And of course, sociologists are really concerned with the social interactions among individuals and groups and how that affects both the political structure and the economic structure here in the United States. There are a number of sources of power in political systems. Of course, there's force. The government can force us to do certain things by passing legislation, and if we don't do those things, putting us in jail. So, for example, we are required to report on our income and pay taxes on our income, and if we choose not to do that, then the federal government can seize our assets and potentially put us in prison for violating tax laws. If we lie about our taxes, that the same kinds of things can happen to us. So that would be an example of force. When we tell another country, you must do this, or we're going to cease interacting with you on an economic basis, which will, have negative impacts on your economy. We're using force there. So that's one way that we can get people or entities to do what we want them to do. But another way is influence. And here you just say, look, this is mutually beneficial to us. We think, this is going to help us. We want you to engage in these activities. For example, we might tell another country, you need to enforce stricter environmental protections on these industries because they are harming the environment, and eventually it's going to have an effect on a global level. And so we can influence them, we can work with them, we can convince them that it's in all our best interest for them to engage in a particular line of activities. And then there's authority. Somebody can, if we think about Dr. Fauci, who has been asked in many cases to step up and tell us, hey, what should we do in regards to trying to control this pandemic? And he would say, we should be practicing social distancing and obeying the CDC's guidelines for helping to curb or flatten the curve of this pandemic. So sometimes we have a person has power because they're educated in a particular area, they're an expert, and they have authority. Police officers have authority to direct our behavior when we've been pulled over, if we're driving too fast or if we're engaging in behavior that is harmful to us or to other people. Police officers have the authority then to come in and try to resolve that situation, and that may involve just counseling someone, or it may involve making an arrest if a crime has been committed. So there are three types of authority that your textbook talks about. There's what is called traditional authority, and this is legitimate power that's conferred by custom and accepted practice. And so, traditional authority, we just accept that police officers can turn on their lights and pull us over, and we have to then explain our behavior and try to demonstrate that we're not, doing anything that's harmful to society. There can be rational legal authority. This is power that's made legitimate by law. So not only do police officers have traditional authority, but they also have rational legal authority. There are laws in place that govern how police officers are supposed to interact with the public. And when they obey those regulations and laws, everything works pretty smoothly. But if they step beyond their bounds and they engage in use of force that's not acceptable, not necessary, then we see that there are some problems, right? And unfortunately, that's been happening. It seems like way too frequently in recent years. And so we've had the Black Lives Matter movement and a number of other entities that have said, hey, wait a minute, police officers need to be held to a higher standard. Okay, and then we have what is called charismatic authority, and charismatic authority is given to someone because they're an influential leader. So if you think about like President Clinton early in his presidency, he was a very charismatic speaker. Not only did he have the traditional authority that's given to the president, but he had the rational legal or the rational law authority given to him by the way the laws are written, and he also had influence over people as a result of his charisma. He was an eloquent speaker, and he seemed like a likable person until he stood before us and shook his finger at us and told us he did not have sex with that woman, which we found out to be a falsehood. Okay, and so all types of authority can be present in a society. But their relative importance will vary from one leader to another. I think President Obama was a very charismatic person. President Trump certainly had the traditional authority that goes with being the president and the rational law authority, but for many Americans, he lacked that kind of charisma because he's got a different kind of personality, right? I certainly wouldn't call him a charismatic personality. Now, in a monarchy, you have a king or a queen and a royal family, perhaps, and they have power. They are the ones who determines who gets what and how and when. Okay. Monarchy is defined as a form of government headed by a single member or a royal family, usually a king, queen, or some other hereditary ruler. They govern on the basis of traditional authority, and most monarchs now have very little practical power. So if you think about the UK, Great Britain, the monarch, the queen, now has very little actual power, but she still has that. She's a figurehead that's kind of at the top of the government, but she doesn't really make the laws. The House of Lords and the House of Commons, the Parliament, and the Prime Minister make the laws for the most part in the UK today. Okay, but they can certainly have some influence, right? An oligarchy is a form of government in which a few individuals rule. Some people are suggesting that today, because of the power of wealthy people in this country, that we're more and more becoming an oligarchy. That a few very wealthy and powerful individuals have more control than they should have. It can often take the form of military rule in some countries, and governments are run by a very few select individuals. Certainly, I think we would say that Cuba was an oligarchy because Fidel Castro was the leader for many years, and then when he got to the point where he could no longer rule, he turned over power to his brother Raul Castro, and now power has now been shifted to another individual, but he's still part of that elite of Cuba, and so and not only is Cuba an oligarchy, but it would also be considered a communist country, right? So, power in China is held by a large but exclusive ruling class called the Communist Party. And many industrialized Western nations might be considered oligarchies because they're ruled by leaders of big business, government, and the military. And we had a president a number of years ago who warned against the military-industrial complex, saying that they were getting too much power And so, I think there are a number of people who today would agree with that statement that the military and certain industries have way too much control over the way our country is governed. Okay. So we have dictatorships and totalitarianism. A dictatorship is a government in which one person has nearly total power to make and enforce laws. So, we might better look at Cuba as a dictatorship rather than an oligarchy, because it really is, the power really is concentrated in the hands of the one person who's ruling, right? Totalitarianism involves virtually complete government control and surveillance over all aspects of a society's social and political life. And so if you think about China and the way that they control what information gets to the populace by, strictly regulating the internet access that people have and what can be allowed into that country. Controlling the people that come to the country. If you want to go to China to spread your religious beliefs, that's unlikely to be approved by the Communist Party of China. And so that certainly would be viewed as a totalitarian government. If you think back to the Tiananmen Square protest, we saw tanks running over students and crushing them to death because they were protesting. That's an example of totalitarianism. Okay, so you can imagine the alarm that people had when, people outside the White House were tear gassed by government forces to clear the way for President Trump to go to that church and hold up the Bible for that photo op. People accused him of engaging in totalitarian types of behaviors. And so there was alarm that spread through many people in this country as a result of his behavior, his constant attacking of the press and the media, calling everything fake news that's not flattering to him, has been viewed as another example of totalitarian or authoritarian types of behaviors. So, as I said, we are a representative democracy. We vote for our representatives who represent us in Austin or in Washington, D.C., or in city government if we are voting for city officials. And that means that it's a form of government in which certain individuals are selected to speak for the people. The United States is a representative democracy. Critics question whether the U.S. Democracy is truly representative, since many groups are not represented in political debates. For example, historically, racial and ethnic minorities have not been well represented. The LGBT community has not been well represented, and people with disabilities have kind of been excluded. And so while we do tout ourselves as a representative democracy, not all groups receive representation. Now, it's getting better. I think we're seeing more diversity in terms of racial and ethnic minorities and LGBT individuals of those communities being represented, but that's a fairly recent, we're talking in the last couple of election cycles where we've seen that become more prevalent. So in terms of political behavior in the United States, there are a number of things that we want to look at here. Citizens of the United States take for granted many of the aspects of our political system. We have a Bill of Rights. We have two major political parties and the possibility of third parties. We have secret ballots. We have an elected president and different state and we have distinct state and federal governments and local governments. So we have a lot of opportunity to influence the decisions that are made at different levels. We can vote for local governments and local government officials. We can vote for our officials at the state level, and then we can vote for people at the national level in our senatorial and representative elections and for president. Unfortunately, we see that eligible voters in the United States, with the exception of this most recent election, tend to vote fairly infrequently. Okay, generally speaking, our voter participation in presidential elections runs about 60-61%. I think this last election, one thing I will say about President Trump is that he definitely motivated people to vote. He received about 74 million votes, but he also inspired a lot of people to vote against him, and so there were 79,800,000 votes against him. He lost by almost 6 million votes in the popular vote. Despite his claims of voter fraud and widespread voter fraud, which have not been substantiated in our courts. Many of those judges that ruled in those courts were selected by both Democrat and Republican presidents, so I really don't think there's a lot of bias there in terms of determining whether fraud actually occurred. So I do believe that President Trump motivated a higher rate of participation among eligible voters in this election. Those who loved him and voted in very large numbers, but those who disapprove of his manner and his policies and voted in slightly higher numbers. As I said, we typically run about 60%. I see here that in 2016, only 51% of those between the ages of 18 and 24 voted. I think the youth vote was a much larger percentage this time around. And, people 65 and older, we see that about 70% of those folks vote. So, but still, when we compare ourselves to other countries that are allowed to vote for their leadership, we tend to be fairly low in participation, which means that we're even less likely to be active in campaigns and running for office ourselves. And so people who don't vote certainly are not going to run for office or work to get somebody elected. So in terms of race and gender in politics, we know that women didn't even get the opportunity to vote until 1920 as a result of the suffrage movement here in the United States. Most Chinese Americans weren't allowed to vote until 1926. African Americans remained disenfranchised until the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. Yes, legally they could vote, but there were a number of things that were obstacles that were thrown up, such as poll taxes and literacy tests and things of that nature that prevented them from being able to cast their votes. In terms of the 2016 election, we see that women made up about 19% of Congress, and racial and ethnic minorities made up 18% of Congress, even though they make up almost half of the population. So vastly underrepresented. But here's the good news, guys. The 2018 midterm elections saw a lot more women running for office, both as Democrats and Republicans, and we saw more minorities not only running for office, but being successful in winning office. In terms of race and gender, we see that there's evidence that females who run for office are covered in a different way than males. And what I mean by that is that sometimes we will see reporters talking about what a candidate is wearing rather than what her policy ideas might be. And so that certainly can be a bit of a problem. We see that in all countries but one, the African Republic of Rwanda, women account for less than half of the national legislative members. Now, women make up 50% of the population in virtually all these countries, in some cases 51%, depending on birth rates and the gender ratio. Women make up about 51% of the population, and yet they make up less than half of the legislatures of all countries except for Rwanda. Rwanda. We see that they are more equally represented there. Okay. The United States ranks 101 among 190 nations in the proportion of women serving as national legislators at the end of 2017. So we're about halfway, in spite of the fact that we promote ourselves as being the country that has the most equality in the world, and that just probably doesn't seem to be true if we look at the way that laws are made in different countries. Okay. So let me take a little break. I need to plug in my laptop so it doesn't die, and we'll be back for part 2, okay?